Live. I'm your host, David Michalek, and with me today is America's favorite credit expert, John Ulzheimer, formerly with Equifax and FICO. John, welcome back.
Hey, David, thank you as always for your kind invitation. I always enjoy my fastest 45 minutes on the internet every few
Yeah, no
Wednesdays with
kidding.
you.
It's always fun. It's like every time before we do a live, I'm like, okay, let me just make sure I know what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully we'll get some really good questions like we normally do, and let's just see where it takes us today. And the next thing you know, I'm looking at the
We're
clock.
done.
I got a little clock
Yeah.
up on the screen here, and it's not live. Like I have to put my cursor over it, and it'll tell me how long we've been live. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's 35 minutes or 45 minutes or it happens. It flies by pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So we got some people jumping on. Thank you so much for joining me and John today. So John, I thought we would start off by talking about, if you could, um, what happens when people send in a dispute letter to the credit bureau. So you worked at Equifax. I know you worked in dispute resolution. Is that what you guys would call it back then? Is it dispute resolution department, or is it called something else? Or
Yeah. Dispute resolution, investigation resolution, any derivative of that term is fine. And back when I was doing it, even though the process is largely the same as it is today, with some notable technological advances, of course. Most of our disputes were, because your question was about how does a letter dispute get handled. Most of our disputes were either on the phone or via a letter. So
yeah.
we would actually get, if you've ever seen one of those white plastic mail bins,
Oh yeah.
um, we
Sure.
would get, I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of letters every single day in those bins. And so and then phone calls, of course. And so the majority of our dispute intake or communications were either through the US mail system or through the telephone system.
Yeah. So not much. Well, telephone disputes still happen today. I know I've had conversations with people that have called up, and usually that's something a little bit more urgent. Like, hey, I just noticed this, and they do that dispute over the phone. But I believe most of it now is still paper, which still in some degree is the standard. And then online disputes are, of course, that kind of makes things easy for everybody. But
That's right.
but specifically, what I wanted to talk to you today, and this is going to tie into, you and I spend a lot of time doing a lot of myth busting, and I think it does two things. One is that it's very entertaining, it's very informative, but I think for a lot of people it kind of hurts their feelings because people in this space, in this credit repair space, which is more my side, not your side, um, people believe a lot of crazy stuff. And one of the things that I hear all the time, I'll see it in the we have ads and posts on Facebook that have 2,000 3,000 comments, and I do the best I can to manage all of it. But sometimes it's just a lot of comments. And one of the things that is always entertaining is like, listen, you got to cite the laws, you got to use a Metro 2 dispute, you got to do this, you got to tell them that you're going to sue, and you know, yeah. And I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't upset people, but and this is one side of our business is that we're actually building the dispute processing side for a lot of really big credit repair companies because they understand that credit Versio is better at reading things and finding mistakes than a human being is. And when we have these conversations with big credit repair companies, one of the questions they never ask us ever, I've never been asked this question is, well, do the letters work? What do they say? Because they know all you have to do is just in a sentence or two, just say what the problem is. There's
Yeah.
no magic. There's no you don't have to browbeat. You don't have to threaten. You don't have to quote laws. So anyway, the reason why I wanted to have you tell us what goes on behind the scenes is so people have an understanding of what, regardless of what that letter says, what really happens when a bureau receives a dispute letter.
Yeah. So, all right. So, a couple things. So, first off, as hard as you try and as hard as I try, someone's always going to get their feelings hurt, right? Because that's why we're here teaching people the way it is, which is different than a lot of than what some people think. And people don't
Yeah.
like being correct. People definitely don't like being corrected, especially if they believe what they know or they think they know is true. So that's number one. Number two, I can assure you the credit reporting agencies understand their obligations under every section of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so, and so quoting it to them does
Right.
not educate the credit bureaus of their obligations to do certain things under the FCRA.
Right.
They know that. But
Right.
whatever. Like people can write whatever letters and use whatever color ink and fold their envelope or fold the dispute letter a certain way. And
Well, some that you told me, and I've heard Steve Rieger said the same thing. And for you watching, Steve Rieger's another mutual friend and a friend of mine that used to run the entire dispute division for TransUnion West Coast. And he said this, you said this, and both of you are saying exactly the same thing. Is like if you send letters that say stuff like that, red flag. That's coming from a credit repair company.
right, that's
Because
right.
who else would do that?
That's right. So the credit reporting agency, and by the way, the credit bureaus talk in that respect to each other. So it's almost counterproductive to do silly crap like that. But okay, so here's what happens. Let's walk through the entire chronology of events. That's probably why we have people watching this, is because they want to see or hear what the actual chronology of events is when you submit a dispute. So step one is the consumer submits a dispute. Now that can be via a letter, via the internet. If you get someone on the phone, you can submit it on the telephone. If you have a working fax number at a credit bureau, I know that's always a hot strategy, is to fax a dispute. You can fax it if that's your thing. When I was at Equifax back in the dark ages, we actually had a room in our center where people who walked in could file a dispute in person.
Yeah.
And we know people who run large conventions that we both attend who have actually shown up and have filed disputes and have asked for disclosure of their credit reports in person just to kind of test the theory. So there's a variety of ways that you can communicate a dispute to a credit reporting agency. But let's just use a garden variety example, not some sort of crazy, sophisticated / exotic method of disputing. Let's just say that I sit down, I write a letter, I lick a stamp, and I drop it in the mail. And the credit bureau gets it, and some person opens that letter. And that letter, so the first thing that happens is the credit bureaus have to understand what that letter is communicating. So you can't just write a letter to a credit bureau and indicate, hey, I disagree with my credit report. Please correct it. Love, John. I mean, you could do that, but nothing's going to happen. The FCRA doesn't require the credit bureaus to be mind readers. So if you send something that a reasonable person cannot understand, then you should expect either a response from the credit bureaus asking you to clarify your dispute, or nothing.
Right.
So that's number one. So make sure that whatever communication you're sending is clear enough so that a reasonable person can understand what's being disputed. Hi, my name is John. Here's my information. There's a XYZ bank account on my credit report that shows that I was delinquent. I've never been delinquent. I've never missed a payment. Please correct it. No one could argue that that is an unclear dispute. So now I've accomplished a couple of things. A, the credit bureaus know who I am, meaning that they can actually pull my credit report and see what they have in their system for me. And two, is I've clearly identified the item that I'm challenging and what it is about that item that I don't agree with. All right. So here's where the credit bureaus now have an obligation to perform. In the FCRA, it's referred to as a reinvestigation, but essentially they have to perform an investigation. And you don't have to stick in your letter, pursuant to the FCRA 1681E, blah, blah, blah. You have to do this. They know they have to do it. But look, to the extent you want to show off and be an amateur lawyer, then go for it. But it doesn't help or hurt anything. All it does is alert them that, hey, that smells credit repairish. Let's continue and see where this takes us. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's important is because one of the components of the FCRA is the ability for the credit bureaus to ignore your dispute if they believe that it's frivolous. So the
Right.
more you make your dispute sound like it's frivolous, the more ammunition you give the credit bureaus to ignore your dispute. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to do that. So keep your letter clear, write it as a consumer would write it, not as an amateur attorney would write it. Send it to the credit bureaus. Credit bureaus open it, see who you are, see what you're disputing, see what it is about that item that you're disputing, and boom, now they have an obligation to perform that investigation. So all of those obligations in the FCRA, the whole 30 days to complete it, etc. Now these obligations have been triggered. So obviously the credit bureaus, and this is another kind of myth of the system, and respectfully, David, this comes out of the credit repair industry, is
Yeah.
that
In
somehow
fact,
the credit,
Satori makes a good point. The problem is all the crappy platforms giving out incorrect
yeah,
information. Yeah.
next time
Truer
I do
words
this,
have never been spoken.
yeah, I'm going to quote you, Satoria, because you nailed it like a hammer on a nail. So, all right. So now the credit bureaus, because the credit bureaus don't have your loan documents with any company or any creditor, clearly they don't know whether or not what you're asserting about your account is correct or incorrect. So that's where the first kind of speed hump occurs with respect to credit repair, is that there's some credit repair letters and communications that like demand that the credit bureaus prove that you were late. Well, that's not their obligation. You don't have an account with the credit bureaus. You don't have a credit card with Experian. You don't have an auto loan with Equifax. So they don't have an obligation to do something there's no FCR obligation for them to prove that you are actually liable for something because they're not the creditor, right? So that's kind of like blending FDCPA with FCRA. And so you can ask them for that, but you're not going to get a favorable response because they don't have an
Yeah.
obligation. No, they don't have loan documents. So what do they do? What is a reasonable thing for a credit bureau to do? Well, a reasonable thing is obviously to contact the company that furnished that information to them, which is usually going to be either a bank or AKA some sort of a financial services company, or be a debt collector, right? So in our little hypothetical scenario, the credit reporting agencies are going to have to contact ABC Bank because they're the ones that furnished this information that is allegedly incorrect. So how do they do that? How do they communicate with these companies? Now, these companies are referred to as data furnishers or furnishers of information. Those are the formal terms that are used in the credit reporting nomenclature as data furnisher or information data. Excuse me, information sent by a data furnisher. So you can communicate with someone like I'm doing with you verbally. I can write a letter, I can make a phone call, I can send an email, I can send a fax, I can smoke signals. But the way that it's done in the credit reporting world is through a communication protocol called eOscar, right? Online solution for complete and accurate reporting. That's what OSCAR stands for. And
Yep.
so think of eOscar. Let's not make this complicated, okay? Because a lot of people try to make this complicated, especially when they're trying to sell letters to people.
Right.
eOscar is basically a telephone line. That's it. It's a line of communication between the credit reporting agencies and some 14,000 companies that furnish information to them. That's it. It's just a method for them to talk back and forth to each other, nothing more. So I am going to now communicate with the company that furnished that allegedly incorrect information to me through eOscar. I'm going to send them a form that indicates that this particular item for this particular consumer is allegedly incorrect. Now, this form is referred to as an automated consumer dispute verification form, or an ACDV.
Mm-hmm.
Back before they became automated, before the A was necessary, they were just called CDVs, consumer dispute verification forms. The difference between an automated form and then the old-fashioned paper form is nothing. It's just automated versus the old-fashioned form, which was on a paper tablet and you'd rip it off like you would any sort of paper tablet. So that form is going to have literally hundreds of fields that are going to indicate the information that the credit bureaus have on file or on record for that particular account. And it's going to leave boxes and blanks where the furnishing party can actually make changes or updates to any of the information with respect to that account that they want to change. The dispute communication that the credit bureau has received is important for another reason, because it's also going to allow the credit bureaus to communicate clearly what it is about the account is being disputed to the furnisher. So if you're disputing the fact that I was never late, you can actually communicate, hey, Mr. Ulzheimer indicates that this account was never late. Please verify whether or not Mr. Ulzheimer has ever been late. And that is communicated in what's called a dispute code. So that entire letter communication that I sent to the credit bureaus is essentially homogenized into a 3-digit code, and that code is going to act like the point guard of a basketball team. It's going to direct the offense, and it's going to direct the defense, and it's going to essentially guide the investigation process and also limit the investigation process for the furnisher.
So that
Also,
so that was a real important. Not to cut you off, John, but this is sort of where I was going with all of this, and this relates to the questions that in posts that I saw this week, which is, hey, you've got to write this long, elaborate letter. You got to put in this Metro 2 code. You got to do this. You got to do that. These are how successful letters are supposed to work. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you've got a 2-line dispute or a 10-page dispute for one account. All of this eventually gets homogenized, as you said, down into a 3-digit code. Is that correct?
yeah,
Gotcha. Okay.
let me give you a great example. There are about 3 dozen of those dispute codes. Okay, um, the very first one on the list is code 001. Code 001 is not his or hers. Please confirm ID. So if you write a letter to the credit bureaus that has one sentence, this account is not mine, or 10 pages explaining why it's not yours, they're both going to end up being homogenized into the same 3-digit code 001, not his or hers. So knock yourself out with your 10-page letters, or you can
Right.
save time and just write, this account isn't mine. I don't recognize this account. And it's going to get homogenized into the same code. So the superfluous pages of text are not going to cause it to be any different than if it's just one line clearly indicating that it's not his, not hers, please
Right.
confirm ID. The letter is actually attached to the dispute form, just like you would attach a document to an email communication, and the furnishing party is required to open it, meaning they can't just respond to those dispute forms without opening or downloading the attachments. So whatever letter you send will be attached to the ACDV form. Now, let me, again, I try to boil this down to the simplest examples so we don't overcomplicate a process which is actually pretty simple. So if let's say that I am Equifax and I send 100 of these dispute forms to a bank today, then tomorrow when the person from the bank gets to work and he or she logs into their eOscar account, they're going to see that there are 100 of these forms sitting there in the queue. Just like if you were to log into your email in the morning and you have 100 unread emails, there they all are, and you get to pick and choose which ones you get to deal with first. And
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow, if you have 100 more, they're going to be the newer ones. You're going to have the older ones. So it's really not that different than getting a ton of emails every single day. And you can kind of see
Yeah.
how they come in a certain order, and you can choose which ones to deal with first and whatnot. So um, now that I see this, and now I'm going to quote unquote process or respond to a dispute, the first thing I need to know is what exactly is it the consumer is disputing. So I pull up the ACDV dispute form. I see the consumer's name. I see the dispute code 001, not his or hers, for example. Um, I see all of the information that the credit bureau currently has on file about that particular account, which I probably have furnished to them at some point in the past. And now that I have all this information, I can actually log into the internal systems of the bank. Usually those are called core systems or master file systems. And that's all of the information about that account. Who is the liable party on the account? What is their identification information? What is the balance of the account? Is the account currently late? All of the things that could possibly be challenged regarding an account, I'm going to have access to because I'm the bank. Then, whatever it is that they're disputing, let's say they're disputing the balance. I can look and see what the balance is, and I can then either respond to that same dispute form indicating, no, the balance really is what we have on file.
Mhm.
Or B, oh, the consumer is right, the balance is wrong. Let me correct the balance by putting the correct balance in to that same form. And when I'm done with my investigation, click send, like you send an email, it goes back to the credit reporting agency and they will make an update in their system. Because they've made an update to their system, they will also carbon copy the other two bureaus, just like in the old fashioned days when you would, fax something to somebody and you would also copy other people on the fax or copy
Mhm.
people on the letter or blind copy people on an email. The credit bureaus will also carbon copy the other reporting agencies so that they can also make corrections to the
You
account if it's
you
in
mean
their
you
system
mean the
as
data
well.
furnisher will carbon copy the other bureaus?
Well, eOscar does that. So it's all something that it goes to the eOscar system, and eOscar is essentially a byproduct of the credit bureaus.
Gotcha. So,
So,
so on the bank, I realize that the dispute, that there's merit to the dispute. It requires a change on my part. I send that via eOscar, and then eOscar is going to update all three bureaus.
well, they're gonna ask the bureau, all three bureaus, to make the update. That's where. So let's be very clear with what happened here. The furnisher just made a request of the credit bureaus to change something. Credit reporting is a handshake. It takes two people to make it work. You have a furnisher that asks the credit bureau, can you change the balance on this account to be whatever? And the credit bureau has to say, okay, I will do it. And they do it. So just because the best that the furnisher can do is ask that something be corrected or
Mhm.
ask that something be deleted. But ultimately, it's the credit bureaus who are the ones who actually have to do the maintenance on the credit report in order to make that change. So once that has been accomplished, meaning that the credit bureau has updated the credit report accordingly, they're now required to provide the results of their investigation. Their investigation is done, it's over. They're now required to provide the results of that investigation to the consumer. And that's usually done in the form of an updated copy of their credit report or an email indicating what has been updated. And that's it. The dispute process is completed and the consumer gets to go on with the rest of their life.
Got it. All right. So, and Jasmine, I'm hoping that you got one more time that this answered your question. So, how is it that the bureau will update and verify without changing anything? So, well, I think the assumption in this is that something needed to be changed. So, if there's a dispute, as John described, I'm not sure, Jasmine, if you were here for the entire time, but what's happening behind the scenes is there's an investigation being performed by the data furnisher, and a change is made if a change is merited. Okay, yep, looks like we got you taken care of. Gregory is back. Good to see you again. I think it's been a while, huh? And then we got
Yeah,
Louis Lou. Glad you're liking the information. All right, perfect.
yeah.
Um,
Just to be clear, the if the consumer disputes something and that entire process takes place that we just explained, and the furniture's like, nah, it's correct, don't change anything, the credit bureaus, they still consider that to be a completed investigation. So in that scenario, there is nothing that's been updated. The information has been verified, and so verified is the outcome of an investigation, just like a deletion is the outcome of an investigation, just like a modification is the outcome of an investigation. Um, so update isn't necessarily synonymous with investigation and vice versa. The outcome of an investigation can be a variety of things, including something that does not look like an update.
yeah, very good. Okay. Anybody have any questions on that? Feel free to post them. We'll be more than happy to answer them. So, John, I know we talk about this quite a bit. In fact, we talked about this. If it wasn't the last time you were on, it was the time before that. But it comes up again and again. In fact, I did a little bit of back and forth with somebody on Facebook, to the point, unfortunately, that I eventually had to block any more posts. And it's not something that I like to do, but if I get to a point where I have to block a post, it's almost always because I cannot permit factually inaccurate information, or the fact that somebody might interpret that as a real method of going through their credit improvement process. And the post was, we were talking about how to handle a collection company. Um, and the question that was asked, this was after we did our live, was, hey, I got a friend of mine that has a co-signed on something and doesn't have the money to. What should they do? That was the question. They co-signed on it. They owe some money. What should they do? And I'm like, well, if they co-sign, they're responsible for the debt. That's part of the deal that you make when you co-sign. One that a lot of people don't think through thoroughly, which is one of the reasons why I've had you do a couple of articles on, and I think a
Yeah.
video too on co-signing. It's a big deal, and a lot of bad credit comes from co-signing.
Yeah.
And my answer was pretty straightforward. Like, hey, listen, I would just make sure that they have a legal right to collect. You want to pay a collection company and find out they don't have a right to collect it, and you'll get a phone call from another one. Doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And then settle the debt, pay it. And a couple of responses that I got were, no, we never pay collections. You don't want to pay a collection company. You can. So anyway, just kind of it spun out of control. I'm like, listen,
Yeah.
there's a reason why a credit report is often referred to, and if you want to distill it down into what it really is, it's a character report. So I got you telling me to not pay debts that you owe.
Yeah.
Do you understand how the credit report is actually proving what it is during this conversation? So maybe we need to revisit. I'm not saying that's anybody watching today, but I think it's really important to revisit the importance of dealing with a collection situation in a very timely manner and not hiding from it.
Yeah. One of the there's a lot of for those who are watching who've never watched our lives before and don't really know who I am and what I do. I do a lot of expert witness work for the defense in Fair Credit Reporting Act lawsuits, and I've been doing that for 17 years, and so I've been doing it for a long enough time that you kind of become familiar with who the usual suspects are on the plaintiff's side, meaning that the law firms or the attorneys that generally represent consumers in these credit related lawsuits. And I don't refer to many lawyers as flesh eaters, but there's actually one in the Eastern District that does a lot of his work in the Eastern District of Virginia, who's kind of generally regarded as being one of the best consumer credit lawyers. And he did a presentation actually at one of Matt's events at CreditCon several years ago, and he echoed what a lot of people have been yelling about co-signing for years, is that the term co-signing is really misleading. There really is no such thing as co-signing. It's also signing.
Yeah,
And
right,
so I think because you're referred to as a co-signer, that it somehow lessens your relationship with the
right.
bank or lessens your liability for the debt. It doesn't. I really wish that it would just be called another signer, or something that doesn't kind of dilute the
Yeah,
relationship between the quote unquote co-signer and their responsibility to make payments. But I get it. You sometimes people don't like being told that, and they wish you had come up with like a magical solution that they hadn't thought of. And a lot of times, unfortunately, in our world, is if you can't communicate professionally with someone, you just start arguing with them and calling them names, and it kind of dilutes into that Twitter bile of
yeah.
communication. So yeah, I also, there's also a guy who does a lot of television and radio in the Southeast who, I heard him make a presentation at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta one time, and he straight up said, you should ignore any debt collector that calls you. And I was like, oh God. Um, that's a really bad idea.
Well,
If
it's all funny, and you notice. Here's where I'd like to have them respond to this: is when they get that person that stands up, or a group of people that stand up and say, "Hey, listen, I took your advice and I got sued. Now what do I do?"
Yeah, you're right.
That's they don't really take that to the next step, which is
Right.
okay, if they can't get a hold of you, and this is a thing that if for everybody watching, if you're not aware of this, there you can be filed in what's called absentia, meaning if they can't find you, let's say something, people sometimes are, as we jokingly call it, on the run, where they're just hard to get a hold of. They've moved a couple of times, collection company can't find them. All they have to do is provide notification by publication. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, John, where if they have a rough idea where you are, let's say, I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada. Let's say they're trying to chase me down, and Las Vegas is the last place where they did a skip trace, and that's where they think I am. They could put a notice in a paper publication. I don't know what that would be in Las Vegas. I mean, there are publications that specialize in this, with just a little ad that says, "Hey, we're trying to reach such so and so for this and this and court date." And I don't even remember exactly what they put in there, John. You might know better than me. And that actually will serve as an attempt, or that will suffice as an attempt to serve. And that attorney can go to court on that court day, and you're not there, and go to the judge and say, "Hey, listen, we tried to chase this guy down. We have a notice of that we served via publication." And the judge might grant the default judgment, which means the next thing you know, you got this. Well, it's not going to be on your credit report anymore, not as of 2018, but you've got a judgment that's been filed against you. So, what are the two things that collection company can now do if they've got a judgment? Well, they can levy your bank account and they can garnish your wages. And a lot of times, that first one, that levy the bank account, comes as a complete surprise. I've heard a lot. I've talked to a lot of people over the phone who got that surprise.
Yeah, I look. So if 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 you start getting communications from a debt collector, either A, you probably should have known it was coming because you have been ignoring your original creditors too long, or B, it comes as a complete surprise because you legitimately have no idea what it is to which they refer in their communications. In either scenario, you have a process that you can take to appropriately and formally deal with it. If you have no clue what it is that they're referring to, you can ask them to validate the debt, and they have to do so. That's a requirement in the FDCPA that they validate the debt. Number two, if you do recognize it and you do know, and it's really not a surprise that the debt collector is starting to contact you, then you can also ask them to validate the debt, which really just buys you a little bit of time. And then number two, you can start talking to them about potentially settling the debt, which accomplishes a couple of things. Number one is that it indicates to them that you're willing to work with them versus ignore them. It's a very different stance as a
Yeah,
consumer relative to the debt collector. And number two, it starts a process of ending it, right? Otherwise, your communication and you're essentially hiding from your cell phone and hiding from your mailbox and hiding from the person knocking at your door is going to go on for years. And that is a miserable way to live. So, to the extent that you open up a line of communication with the debt collector, it at least gets you one step closer to putting it to an end. And putting it to an end can be a settlement of the account, or if they can't validate the debt, then obviously they can't attempt to collect it any longer. Normally, it's been my experience that normally as much garbage as credit or debt collectors catch, the majority of the time they really are trying to collect a debt that they believe is valid. And the exception to that is if the consumer was the victim of identity theft with some original creditor, maybe like an apartment complex or some lender, and they outsourced it to a debt collector. Now the debt collector is trying to collect the debt that the consumer is saying, "Dude, I never lived there. Or, I never applied for that account," or this balance, I have no idea who this creditor is, and they've legitimately been the victim of fraud. And again, if that's the case, then there are steps that you can take to
yeah,
deal with it in a formal and appropriate manner. What you can't do is what I see some consumers do, and it is they kind of take the position that, you know what, I didn't ask to be in the credit reporting system. I didn't ask to be the victim of fraud. I didn't ask for something wrong to be put on my credit report, so I'm not going to do anything to help you. And look, that's your right, but what you're also doing is you're making it harder for everyone to solve the problem. And there are a lot of these debt collectors have policies in place where they require you to fill out a fraud affidavit
Mhm.
or file a police report. And if you're like negative, I'm not doing any of those things. And you know what? You smell and look like the same person who's trying to get something removed under false pretenses. There really is no difference. You've got you who's refusing to participate, and you've got someone who's trying to run the ruse of, I'm really liable for this, but I'm faking that I've been the victim of identity theft. You don't look
Yeah.
any different than that person. So you
Right.
shouldn't be expected to be treated any differently than that person. So it's just one of those things that it's what do some businesses call it, David? The cost of doing business. It's
Hmm.
it's the cost of being a consumer. Is that
Hmm.
sometimes we're the victims of fraud, and there are certain minimal steps that we should take in order to help out other organizations who think we're liable for debts. If it were me, I would be falling over backwards trying to help them to convince
Right.
them that it's not me, that it signed all these documents and took out all these loans. So, so again, working with the debt collector, and I don't get paid by a debt collector. I have no skin in this game. But I do see it from kind of the litigation perspective. Working with a debt collector is going to be infinitely more um, having a favorable outcome for the consumer than just burying your head in the sand and pretending like none of that stuff exists.
Yeah. Maybe you get lucky and it'll disappear. You know, maybe the worst that happens is it gets sold to another collection company. Worst case scenario, maybe they sue you. Yeah,
That's
and
right.
that and nothing good comes from that.
No.
Cliff has a question here. What happens after you disputed an item, but the furnisher hasn't responded to the credit reporting agency with a response in 40 days?
Yeah, that's to the extent that you're trying to get the item removed, that's good news for you. The credit reporting agencies are will not maintain information that is not verifiable. So that's one of the ones that kind of flies under the radar a little bit. Is that obviously they can't maintain information that they know to be incorrect. They also can't maintain information that is unverifiable. So if I don't know how long you've been on the live, Cliff, but if you were here at the beginning and we talked about kind of the chronology of events that occurred in the dispute process. So if you lodge a dispute and you kind of like start the ball rolling on all of those steps, and the credit bureau sends the dispute form to the furnisher through eOscar and doesn't ever get a response back, then they're going to delete it. And on those forms, there is actually a response due date. So it's not a secret that a response is required, and B, it's required by a certain date.
Yeah.
And so and I can assure you that date is not 40 days out. So if your example is a real example, then that item would have been deleted by the credit bureaus because it was unverifiable. Now, don't log off because you think you got the answer you wanted and you're happy with it. You need to let me give you the PS. The PS is that item can always be reinserted. If on day 41 the furnisher responds to that dispute form, or refurnishes that account through the normal monthly furnishing update that most banks and whatnot do every single month, usually once every statement cycle period, then they can absolutely reinsert that information to the credit bureaus because now it has been verified.
Hmm.
And the credit bureaus are supposed to notify you of the reinsertion, but nonetheless, just because something has been removed doesn't mean that removal is permanent. In some cases it is, but certainly reinsertion it's actually a process that's defined in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and there are obligations when an item is reinserted. So it's a real thing, and it does absolutely happen.
We got, I think, three questions here we'll get to, and that might take us to the end of our day here.
Okay.
Um, Actually, a comment from Gregory co-signing, in my view, is I'm vouching for this person, and if they cannot pay, I accept the responsibility for their actions. Yep, that's exactly right, Gregory. And
That's a
I
healthy way of looking at it. That's
very,
I David, in your experience, have you ever, and this is kind of a loaded question, or a question to which I already know the answer. Have you ever talked to a consumer who said, hey, I just want to reach out and let you know how well my cosigner scenario went? It went really, really well. Nothing
Yeah.
bad happened. Everything
Right.
was paid. I can tell you, in 31 years, I've never ever had that conversation with a consumer. Any
Yeah.
conversations I have with consumers with respect to co-signing is always something like this. Oh my God, I was just a signer for the credit. It wasn't even my car. I never drove it. I have no idea
Yeah.
where it is. I'm trying to get this repossession off my credit report. That's the conversation
Yeah.
that
100%.
generally occurs. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Carl C. with a question. I owe two credit cards with Capital One. Capital One sold the debts to a collection agency. Should I pay the debts? So, Carl, I'm not sure how long you have been on the live, but that's really one of the things that John and I, the second part of this live that we started talking about is the bad information. I'm not saying that this is what you were given. I'm just saying that in general, like if you go to the, as John likes to say, the blogosphere, which I guess that's part of YouTube and TikTok and Facebook, that you'll hear a lot of people say, don't pay debts, don't pay your collections. And we
Mm.
just spent a couple of minutes talking about what the negative aspects are of doing that. And that always you want to try to, you want to settle these debts. The advantages, maybe, is if you're working with a third party collection company who's collecting on behalf of Capital One, that maybe you can do some kind of a settlement that's a little bit less than what that face value is. Uh, that's if they bought the debt, if they were assigned the debt. I don't know if it's just as easy to negotiate that price down, but you might have some leverage there.
What
Any,
nor David, what normally happens, so there's two different scenarios. And if Carl is still listening, if you can kind of quickly chime in, do you know if it was really sold to the debt buyer or if it was just assigned to a collection agency? Because those are two different things.
yeah,
If Cap One really sold the debts, then they sold them to what's called a debt buyer. And a debt buyer generally has a relationship or an affiliation with a debt collector who is now going to try to collect the debt that the debt buyer actually owns. And so now in that scenario, you do not have accounts with Cap One anymore. You don't owe Cap One any money anymore because they have essentially washed their hands of it. They've sold the relationship to a debt buyer, and now they become your new creditor, even though you have no idea what that company is and you've never heard of them before. So in that scenario, the debt buyer probably purchased that debt along with a block of hundreds of millions of dollars of defaulted debt, maybe more, and they generally pay very small amounts on the dollar to buy that block of debt. And therefore, it puts you in a better position because now you can probably negotiate a settlement with the debt buyer slash debt collector because even though you may have owed Cap One $1,000, the debt buyer didn't pay $1,000 for your debt. So they paid something much smaller, and they don't generally disclose how much they pay, but you can assume it's somewhere in the pennies on the dollar
yeah,
range. So if you were to go in and offer a fair settlement amount, then it may be attractive to them because they're still going to make a tremendous margin on the purchase of that debt because they paid so little for it. So that's in the debt buyer scenario. If it's really just a consignment to a debt collection company or a third party debt collector, then the debt collector does not own the debt. But normally, what happens when debts are assigned to a third party debt collector, there is an agreement between the debt collector and the original creditor that gives the debt collector some pre approved leniency with respect to settlements. So they may be able to offer you settlements even without having to go back to the original creditor and getting them approved because they've gotten them essentially pre approved when the debts were assigned to them. So in either scenario, the debt buyer scenario or the debt collector scenario, I would absolutely suggest you start throwing the word settlement around because that gets debt buyers and debt collectors really excited that you're willing to work with them to take care of the debt. And of course, once you settle the debt, regardless of who it's with, that's it. If you settle a $1,000 debt for $500, that's it. You don't owe anybody the other $500. Now, you may get a 1099-C, which indicates that there was a forgiveness of some percentage of the debt, and that may be taxable. And I'm not a tax expert, and I've never said I was a tax expert. So if you have someone that does your taxes or preps your taxes, you're going to want to take that 1099-C to them, because that may be considered income, because it was
Yeah.
essentially the forgiveness of a debt that you actually owed.
Yeah, and that's what that rolls us
Look at
right
that.
into Miss Gibbs right here. So I received a 1099-C from a creditor to file with my taxes. Can the creditor continue to report the balance owed on my credit report? Answer is no. But so yeah, that means they have done this with the debt. You're going to be taxed as what kind of? Do you remember what kind of income that's referred to?
I don't know. I don't. Again, I'm
Yeah,
not a tax expert. But the one thing, regardless of this is Carl or Greg or Miss Gibbs or anybody who asks the questions about, you're going to want to get all this stuff in writing. Okay, don't just have a verbal conversation and start sending money to people. Make
yeah,
sure you get this stuff in writing. And most of the large debt collectors are my clients, because a lot of them get sued repeatedly, and so I've seen they all have letter communications and templates that they send to the debtors that indicate you owe this, we're willing to accept that by this date. So this is not like informal stuff. This is all formalized in writing. Just make sure you get and you keep those documents.
You know, one thing I saw, John. I don't know if you and I talked about this, but I saw this about I want to say 6 8 months ago, where somebody got a collection letter, and it directed. Oh no, I know who it was. So anyway, they have a method. They have software that they're selling to collection companies now, where they'll send the debtor a notice that, hey, listen, we have this dollar amount, and you can actually set up your own pay. Like, you do everything online. So it's got some kind of software that's guiding everything. It's like, well, uh, put in what payment you think you can afford, and it'll extrapolate and tell you how long it's going to take to pay it off and everything. And they're using, I think, social media to push this out, because they're having, obviously it's hard to. I mean, now that we walk around with these, we're not tethered to a phone anymore. It's hard to get a hold of people. But I thought that was pretty. I thought it was actually pretty amazing how much flexibility they were giving people to pay off debts just to make something happen. So it
Yeah.
just goes to show how flexible a lot of third party debt collectors can be. All right, I think we had.
I'll tell you a funny, I've got a really good friend of mine who owns a really big collection agency. And right around tax refunds time, they will send out a promotion to the debtors that they're trying to collect from. And the promotion will be like, hey, if you contact us within 48 hours, we'll give you an additional 15% off on your settlement, because they know they probably just got their tax refund. And
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah,
these guys they're not idiots. Okay. As much as people tend to dislike them, it's a really good business to be in.
yeah,
Obviously, there's a ton of regulations you've got to follow: FDCPA, FCRA. You've got to deal with the constant barrage of frivolous disputes from credit repair companies, and but nonetheless, it's a good business to be in.
yeah. In fact, one of my good friends out here in Las Vegas. Las Vegas has a very interesting group out here. I mean, I don't know if there's a larger concentration of attorneys anywhere in the country, and the personal injury is big out here to the point where it's kind of comical. But there's a lot of attorneys here that specialize in the debt business, in debt collection, and including one of my good friends out here. And that's all he does all day long, is he prepares cases for to sue people who owe debts, and that's his 8 hour day right there. And one thing he'll say is like, listen, I mean, he's said this to me many times. Not that he needs to tell me this, but he's like, listen, they try to tell people, negotiate, do a settlement or something, because you don't want to be on the opposite side of me. Because when they prepare cases, you're not going to win. Most
Yeah.
unless there's something frivolous going on, you're not going to win. They don't go to court with the hope of winning. They go to court with all their ducks in a row, and they have everything in line. Okay, so let's see. Let's where we at time wise here. Yeah, okay, we're getting ready to wrap up. Let's take Oh, Miss Gibbs, Jefferson Capital uses that. Yeah, thank you very much. I knew that there are companies out there. Jefferson's a pretty big one too. All right. Last question from Gregory. How many years and how many times can a debt be sold or transferred from one company to another? Great question.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any limit to the number of times a debt can be sold from one company to another. Obviously, there's a limit for how long those debts can be credit reported and a limit for how long you can sue to collect those debts. But
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any cap on there. There certainly is nothing in the credit industry's reporting guidance that indicates that if something's been sold more than X times, you can't report it. So it does not appear that there's any sort of cap. There's also nothing in the FCRA or FDCPA that caps the number of times a debt can be sold or assigned or
Yeah.
reassigned.
Yeah, things like this just kind of get long in the tooth. You know what I've experienced, and John, maybe your friend who owns a collection company might verify this. This is my suspicion, just from looking at tens of thousands of credit reports, is that I think by the time a debt has floated around, maybe two companies or so, I don't think there's a lot of belief from that third or fourth or fifth company that are going to buy that debt. It's like, hey, listen, if Jefferson Capital couldn't collect, if Midland Funding couldn't collect, if LVNV couldn't collect, what success am I going to have? Or what business model do I have that's going to be more successful than what these guys did? So
Yeah.
it's been my experience that collections usually two times, maybe three times. I've never seen anything more than that. That's one thing that Credit Versio can pick up on. It actually will recognize if a debt, let's say the first credit report, it was owned by, let's say it's a Verizon, just pulling something out of the air, and even though Verizon, it's probably not a great example because Verizon tends to collect a lot of their own debt. Let's just say it's Synchrony Bank, and it start off with LVNV, and then it disappears or whatever. Then maybe several months later, it gets picked up by Midland. Well, Credit Versio can tell just by some of the data that's in the fields. And then let's just say later on it gets deleted or whatnot, and it shows up somewhere else. It's something that's also very trackable. But we don't see like third leg um, uh, uh, debts being bought. Usually it's one, two, and then it's out of the picture.
Yeah, that's been my experience also. First one, yeah. Second one, yeah. And that's kind of it.
Yeah, pretty much. Maybe you'll get somebody who bought it for 2 cents on the dollar, and like, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll do like what your buddy did, and I'll just send out a whole bunch of letters, next to tax season, and let's see if we can get a little bit of, let's see if we can get the pockets jingling. And most of the time, it probably doesn't work, but you might catch somebody at a good time. They're like, yeah, let me get this off my chest. It's been around for a long time, where they think maybe it's going to be reported again when it's really not. So but it doesn't happen very often in my experience. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. All right, good group today. Great questions today. Good audience. Everybody, thank you so much for
Yeah.
participating. And John, thank you again for joining me. So the way it's going to work is John will be back next Wednesday, and then we're going to be dark for about 3 weeks or so. I'm doing some traveling and got a vacation coming up. But I'll post it up on Facebook. Okay, thanks again, everybody. John, thank you very much, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
All
Take
right.
care.
Have a good night.